Film sits at an intersection of three different kinds of art. Visual art, like painting or sculpture, audible art, like music, and narrative art, like stories. Now, there's often overlap between these. Art like triptychs or the Bayeux Tapestry can tell stories, and some sculptures make noise, but film in particular stands out as a meeting of these elements. Different movies include them in differing ratios, but most films seem to emphasize the narrative aspect most heavily. We love art house movies for their gorgeous cinematography, and for some movies the soundtrack is so prominent it's almost its own character. But most people watch movies because they want to watch a story. This is so pervasive that when we see a film that bucks narrative convention, we find it weird or unsettling, even if the movie is otherwise good. Perhaps the premier example of this is 2001: A Space Odyssey. It's constantly held up as one of the most influential films ever made, and routinely makes top 10 lists of best movies ever. And yet, talk to any rando on the street and they'll probably say that they're not really a fan or that they don't get it. And honestly, I'm kind of with them there. It is a bit pretentious, and the most interesting part to watch, at least for me, is the third part with Hal and the astronauts. Now, why is that? It's because that part has a strong narrative. 2001 is broken into 4 parts, essentially an anthological look at human history. The first part shows how proto-humans, either under the influence of or simply observed by, it's never made clear, that big black slab, figure out how to murder each other with bones. Then there's an epic-ass transition, time-skipping a few millennia, and then we get, for my money, the most boring part of the movie, as most of the second part is taken up by playing Blue Danube in full. Twice as we watch a spaceship slowly drift across the vastness of space. And then there's something about a new big black slab, György Ligeti's iconic screeching chorus. And then we get the third part, which focuses on 2 astronauts having to deal with their onboard computer suddenly going rogue and trying to kill them. The surviving astronaut successfully shuts down the evil AI, and he is our point of view in the 4th part, easily the weirdest, which is mostly taken up by what at the time would have been revolutionary visual effects and today is just your average screensaver. Something something museum room, something something aging, something something big space baby, the end. Now, I'm not going to try to explain 2001 to y'all, first because that's not the focus of this video, and second because a lot of it is way too ambiguous anyway, but the main through line seems to be on how humanity evolves, first from quote-unquote lower primates to spacefarers to ascended space babies the size of planets for some reason. So there's an overarching pseudo-narrative, but it's focused on humankind as a pseudo-character, which makes it harder to follow than a story focused on individuals. And really, it seems like the filmmakers, headed by director Stanley Kubrick, were less interested in telling a story through dialogue and character interactions, but in expressing themes and ideas through imagery and music. And a lot of it is unequivocally iconic, from the monolith to the floating pen to
"I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that,"
to all the weirdness at the end. It's not a film you'll probably ever want to re-watch, but it is one you should watch at least once, especially since so much of sci-fi since has taken inspiration from it. Hell, the reason the opening of Barbie was so goddamn funny is because it was, pardon the pun, aping the beginning of 2001. And if you weren't familiar with this piece of media, you wouldn't have gotten the joke. Me, I laughed my ass off. Several films have tried to be the next 2001 with mixed results. Tree of Life tried to do the whole abstracted story of a human life thing, but much more forgettable, and I hate shaky cam at the best of times. It makes me nauseous. Interstellar tried to be the next space epic, but in my opinion it was too focused on the narrative, making it feel smaller in scope, being so interested in the characters and the directions and arcs that the sci-fi setting ends up feeling more like furniture than the reason for being there. I think a much better example is Melancholia, which, though narrative and character focused, has a much less conventional story and is very interested in imagery and themes. It's very clear by the end that what we are watching is an allegory for depression, and it makes for a very profound viewing experience. Narrative can be comfortable, almost a crutch, and when we're shaken out of it by a non-narrative piece of media, it can be jarring and confusing, and we can react to it negatively because it's not what we're expecting. But this reliance on narrative can have us hyper-focused on the literalness of what we're watching and leave us unable to properly engage with the themes that the creator wants us to. Steven Universe has gotten a lot of flack since its ending because the space Nazis weren't subjected to space Nuremberg trials. And first of all, this is a kid show. I don't think that's really appropriate. And second, these people are missing the entire point, which is that Steven Universe is a trans allegory, and the ending of the main show, not including the movie or future, is an escapist fantasy about being able to reconcile with previously abusive family members. It tells queer kids that no, it's not normal for your own parents to hate and hurt you for who you are, and yes, it is possible for them to change their minds about you.
She prefers to be called Stephen.
It gives hope and purpose to kids who might otherwise have had none, and I will never not be grateful to Rebecca Sugar for giving us this piece of media. And Steven Universe also has a very heavy focus on visuals and music, leaning into the fantastical, and yes, I'll get to why y'all are all here. The first feature film to focus on music and imagery over narrative was Disney's third production, Fantasia. Originally called The Concert Feature, it was imagined as a night at the theater, listening to an orchestra playing a selection of classical pieces while providing an animated simulacrum of what you might see in your mind as you listen. The first piece chosen was The Sorcerer's Apprentice by Paul Dukas, originally intended as a self-contained Mickey Mouse short, but when the budget spiraled out of control, the filmmakers decided to expand to a feature-length anthology, adding on Bach's Toccata and Fugue in D minor, Tchaikovsky's Nutcracker Suite, Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, Beethoven's Sixth Symphony, Ponchielli's Dance of the Hours, Mussorgsky's Night on Bald Mountain, and lastly, Schubert's Ave Maria. Threading all of these together into a single tapestry is the MC for the program, Deems Taylor, who gives background information for all the segments, and also justification for why to even bother watching this. He also explains that some of what you will see
tells a definite story,
while others will be more abstract. And right off the bat, we start with the abstract. Toccata and Fugue, as Deems infodumps, is purely a description of the form of music. A toccata being a piece intended to show off how good you are at playing your instrument, and a fugue being a heavily structured style of counterpoint, the musical term for multiple melodies played at the same time, complementing each other. During the toccata, all we see is the orchestra, focusing in on the various instruments as they are featured with colorful lighting, making them stand out in the indigo void in which they are playing. And through it all, we keep cutting back to arguably the main character of this film, conductor Leopold Stokowski.
Leopold!
The conductor is perhaps the most important part of the orchestra. Sure, the instrumentalists help, but the conductor isn't just standing there looking pretty while they all stare at the music. The conductor sets the tempo, dictates relative volumes of different instruments, decides how many players are on each part, informs players on particular styles needed for a piece, and does all the managerial things needed, like auditions, rehearsal scheduling, and finding venues and pieces for performances. They're also responsible for editing, arranging, and reorchestrating pieces to suit their ensemble, particularly if the original composer's no longer alive. The conductor takes a herd of musicians, each with their own thoughts and idiosyncrasies, and wrangles them into a single living instrument. And good conductors can be as well known and respected as composers, if not more so, especially when they involve themselves in music education, like Leonard Bernstein. And no conductor has left a mark on music quite like Stokowski.
Leopold!
Where most conductors would use a baton, he used just his hands. Where many conductors will focus on the classics that people want to hear again, he would showcase new composers, conducting premieres for living composers of the time, including Shostakovich, Mahler, and Hindemith, three of my favorites. He also would be very bold in rearranging pieces, getting him into trouble with music critics and composers, which we'll discuss more when we get to Stravinsky, who felt that a faithful adherence to the composer's intent is better. But Stokowski, much like Disney, was an adapter, which is probably why they got along so well. As we've seen already, even with just Snow White and Pinocchio, Disney built his brand by putting his own spin on classic stories, changing what he felt needed changing, and Stokowski did the same thing with music. And that's especially apparent for the toccata and fugue. Bach was one of the last Baroque composers, an oft-ignored era of the Western musical tradition, as modern listeners tend to think of that style as stodgy or boring, despite the fact that Baroque implies something gaudy and extravagant.
If it's not Baroque, don't fix it.
The piece was written for the organ, yes, the kind in a church, and when played on it as originally intended, it's still a good piece of music, but when Stokowski gives it to the orchestra, it comes alive. The colors of the various instruments and the changes in tempo and holds and crescendos make the piece sound almost romantic. The musical period, that is, marked by a style intended to evoke great emotion. Think Beethoven and Tchaikovsky. Stokowski's arrangement of the toccata and fugue remains one of my favorites to this day. In fact, while skimming Wikipedia while writing this, I saw they had an audio clip of a recording, and I just had to listen to the whole thing. It's so good! When I play this piece on the piano, I try to match Stokowski's interpretation of it, and I don't think I'm alone in that. So in the film, when the toccata ends, we leave the orchestra behind as the fugue begins, and for the first time we see what the animators have envisioned for us. Unconstrained by line work, we are invited into a moving, breathing painting, and I'm still astounded at how this was achieved without computers. Like, seriously, a lot of this looks like AI art if an AI were actually a competent artist with direction and purpose and not just an algorithm built off of stolen training images. More than any other piece of animation I have seen in my entire life, this looks like it was taken out of an actual imagination, with the animators given free rein to put to ink and celluloid whatever fluttered through their minds. There's neither rhyme nor reason here, no pretension to narrative, simply stream of consciousness imagery, in a way that most people should recognize as similar to how their own minds work. And it all fits the music perfectly. A lot of the time when making a creative work, whether music or writing or film or heck of video essay, you get to a point where you go, this is fine, it doesn't need to be perfect, it just needs to be done, and you phone in the last little bit. The animation of this piece seems like every part of it was exactly what the animators intended, all done to the same meticulous level of quality. And yet, it has no narrative, no story. Is it a music video? Is it an experiment? Is it just a screensaver? It's all of those things, yet none of them. It is art. I have no idea what the animators were thinking when they made this, but the experience of just letting yourself go, to be carried away by these rolling hills and rippling waves of light, is exquisite. You forget everything else and you just listen to Stokowski's Bach, absorbed into color and form and sound. Maybe something in this speaks to you, dear viewer, in a profound way, and if it does, I would love to know what it is in the comments. The remaining pieces showcased in the film all have some level of narrative structure to them, though there does not seem to be any sort of overarching theme or message to tie them together into a cohesive whole, which still bucks narrative convention. They are included simply because Stokowski, Disney, and his animators liked how they each individually sounded, or because they immediately knew what imagery they wanted to animate for them. A cabaret of 1930s music videos. The second segment is in fact a kind of mini Fantasia within the larger film, a fractal anthology of minutes-long pieces, the Nutcracker Suite. Now, the Nutcracker story definitely has a narrative, but as Deems exposits beforehand,
You won't see any Nutcracker on the screen.
the animators ditched the entire established storyline that viewers at the time would have expected and created something based purely on what they felt when listening to the music. We see fairies, dancing mushrooms, dancing fish with bedroom eyes, dancing flowers, and the changing of seasons. And you have to admit, Tchaikovsky's music fucking slaps. There's a reason why it often gets used in movie trailers, though usually Christmas movies. It's full of life and energy. It makes you want to get up and dance yourself, and that life is given, well, life by the animators, matching the music's energy and then some. Side note, it is hilarious to me that Deems claims the Nutcracker doesn't get performed much because now, 80 years later, it is the most performed ballet, at least in the US. It is highly possible that Fantasia itself is responsible for that, though. The Sorcerer's Apprentice is the most narrative segment of the film, in large part because the original music follows the story as told by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Mickey is the titular apprentice, studying under the sorcerer Yen Sid. Yes, that's Disney backwards. That's like the most basic piece of trivia. He's a bit lazy, so he enchants a broom to do his work for him. At first it seems great, until it turns out he can't stop what he started, and it all gets out of hand. The message is as subtle as a baseball bat to the face, but there's a good reason why this is the most iconic of Mickey's performances. The music, led by the bassoons, is perfectly paired with the animation, often with literal Mickey mousing, the term for when a film score is used in place of Foley sound effects, like the old silly symphonies. In fact, the entire soundscape is just that. There's not a single word of dialogue, no sound at all, apart from what's written in the musical score. While this is entirely a narrative piece of art, it is told through action, gesture, expression, and melody and harmony. A premier example of show, not tell. Now, while all the pieces thus far mentioned had received minor edits or changes, the Nutcracker Suite in particular dropped its overture in March, the next piece, by contrast, was heavily changed, much to the chagrin of the then still living composer Igor Stravinsky. His Rite of Spring had premiered in Paris in 1913, just 27 years prior to the release of Fantasia, and allegedly started a riot. But he strongly objected to how Stokowski arranged it for the film, even though he himself continued to edit the ballet multiple times, even after Fantasia's release. And he wasn't alone in thinking this. Many critics of the time thought that pairing animation with music only detracted from the music, and several of them apparently walked out of their screenings early in protest. And yet, despite this, it is likely largely due to Fantasia that the Rite of Spring is played at all anymore. Art survives when it is preserved, when it is championed. There are hundreds of dead composers who likely wrote beautiful music which is never played anymore, because they had no champions among conductors of orchestras. Fantasia made classical music accessible. You didn't have to put on a fancy suit and pay for an expensive theater ticket to listen to Stravinsky. You could just walk into a Nickelodeon to experience it as easily as Gone with the Wind or Casablanca. In the decades following Fantasia's release, you had a similar phenomenon with Looney Tunes, who almost exclusively used classical music for their soundtracks, since most of it was public domain, meaning you didn't have to pay for rights or pay a composer to make something new. There are multiple generations living today who know Suppé's Light Cavalry Overture,
Horses wanted for U.S. Army. Hey, I'm a horse.
Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsody, and Rossini's Barber of Seville, because that's what we heard while watching Bugs Bunny and company do all their silly antics. As for the content of the Rite of Spring segment, it takes an almost documentary-style look at the evolution of the Earth and the life upon it, according to the best scientific knowledge of the time. And for its time, it's practically radical. The Scops monkey trial happened just 15 years earlier, and yet here we have over 20 minutes of volcanoes and primordial soup and dinosaurs, with not a god, nor a Jesus, nor a snake with an apple fetish in sight. This is probably the segment most people remember, because for folks in the 1940s, this would have been one of the first times they saw dinosaurs in motion as living, breathing, eating creatures trying to survive fearsome predators and natural disasters. And Stravinsky's dissonant chords and odd rhythms are a genius pairing for this, keeping the audience slightly alienated. These are not people we are watching, but strange creatures from the past. This is different, almost uncomfortable. For me, my favorite part is the very end, when the earth is being rent by earthquakes, all while the French horns shriek animalistically. It surprised me to find out years later that this was a Stokowski invention. The original Stravinsky score is dominated by percussion rolls. And if I'm being honest, I like the French horn squealing a lot better. One thing that is often lost in the film, though, is the very beginning with the high bassoon solo. Which, while clearly heard in a concert hall, often is barely audible on a home TV, particularly off of a VHS cassette or DVD. I remember watching it as a kid and wondering why there wasn't any music playing yet. It was just too soft for my parents' VHS player to register. It's funny, Stravinsky wrote that solo deliberately at the very edge of the bassoon's range to make it sound uncomfortable and unnatural, but it has become a cornerstone of the bassoon repertoire to the point where it is expected that that every professional bassoonist should be able to play it. What is radical becomes expected, what is uncomfortable becomes comfortable, and what is strange becomes normal. Now at this point we have had over an hour of music and animation, which is longer than more than one of the other entries in the canon. So Disney decided to add in an intermission, which would have been and still is normal for a concert, both to let the audience pee and stretch, as well as to let the musicians rest for a few minutes before playing again. During this intermission, Deems Taylor talks to the soundtrack, a sort of accurate animated representation of the combined frequencies of recorded music, as you might see on an oscilloscope or the old Windows Media Player. It's a moderately amusing look at the different sounds different instruments make, which brings us to our next question. Why should we care about orchestral music? Why is this important? In contemporary discourse, there's often a pushback against media that seems very heavily focused on dead white guys, often to the exclusion of the voices of women or people of color. And in a lot of cases, I honestly think I agree with those motivations. There are a lot of books and movies that are only considered good or important because a bunch of exclusionist gatekeeping cis straight white men liked them. Not all of them actually are any good, particularly if they only speak to a very narrow experience, that of privileged cis straight white men. A century ago, a high school literature curriculum would have only included things like the Bible, Shakespeare, Mark Twain, Gulliver's Travels, and Plato and Aristotle. But when you only teach that, you miss out on everything else out there. Female authors like Mary Shelley, Ursula K. Le Guin, and N.K. Jemisin, and that's only in science fiction. Instead of just white authors, read Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart or Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. Instead of just biblical stories or Arthurian legend, cast a wider net to Egyptian or Aztec mythology, or stories from African or Chinese or Native American traditions. But that's not to say we should be throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I love Mark Twain, and Gulliver's Travels is a fantastic book, especially if you keep reading into the second half when it gets really weird. Gulliver goes to Horseland and concludes that horses are better than people. It's wild. The idea should be to tear down the gates and let everyone in, regardless of background, but to also keep what deserves to be kept. And for the Western classical tradition, there is so much beautiful music here if you just give it a chance. Now I get it, pop music is catchy and metal is loud, and hip-hop can feel subversive and cathartic. And most modern music tends to be 3 minutes long or less, so it can play on the radio between commercials. Most people can spare 3 minutes, and most such music is pretty easy to listen to. An orchestral piece, by contrast, can last over an hour, and for certain symphonies the first 3 minutes can just be quiet build-up. By the time Holding Out for a Hero has finished playing, a symphony by Mahler would have barely even started. But if you broaden your attention span and give it a chance, you might find there's a richer, more complex music there. An orchestra can do a whole lot more than a couple guitars and a drum set. Now that's not to say that modern bands can't make good music. Believe me, I could listen to Queen or ABBA all day, and Ariana Grande and Britney Spears have become guilty pleasures for me recently, if I'm being honest. And Jimi Hendrix's rendition of the US anthem at Woodstock is one of the best musical performances in all of history ever. But sometimes, if you really want goosebumps, if you really want your heart to soar, you need to be willing to invest the time and dive into classical music. Now, a related critique that classical music often gets is that it's elitist, and you might have been forming such an opinion as you listened to me rant about pop music on the radio just now. And maybe 100 years ago, when the only way you could listen to a symphony was to get dressed all fancy and go to a theater and listen to an orchestra, that was the case. But we have recordings now. We have YouTube. You can listen to almost anything you want to, whenever you want to. There has never been greater access to music than right now. And there's so much of it! The Western classical tradition is old, and it includes a lot of different music, and it's still being created now. There are living composers writing music for orchestras, and they're not just mimicking Beethoven over and over. They're exploring new ways to make music, often borrowing back from more popular genres like rock and roll or hip-hop or metal or jazz, or just leaping off into the unknown to try things no one's ever done before. That's what Stravinsky was doing in the first half of the 20th century. Now, after Fantasia, Rite of Spring is an important part of the classical canon and performed frequently, but when it first came out, it was almost frightening. No one had ever heard music like that before. And it only got weirder from there with Schoenberg's 12-tone system, and then to postmodernists like Philip Glass and John Adams. That last guy wrote an entire opera about President Nixon going to China, and the music is unlike any classical music you've ever heard and is still fantastic.
The people are the heroes now. The heathen holds the peasants all.
I Am the Wife of Mao Zedong is one of my favorite opera arias, period. Anyway, that's probably a long enough tangent, and intermission is probably over by now. Where were we? Right. Next up in the program is some good old Beethoven. His 6th Symphony, often called the Pastoral. Nowadays, his 5th and his 9th are more well known, but this is still a lovely piece of music. The Disney animators found it reminded them of ancient Greece, so here we see satyrs and centaurs and pegasuses romping and playing and stamping grapes into wine for Bacchus. And yes, this is clearly Bacchus, you can tell because Bacchus is fat while Dionysus is lithe and muscular. Choose your own sexy. Zeus shows up to ruin the fun, aided cheerfully by Hephaestus, before he gets bored and takes a nap, and the mythological creatures all watch adoringly as Apollo's day gives way to his sister Artemis's night. Now, you thought we were gonna get through this without a racist caricature, didn't you? That's because it's very, very likely you've seen an edited version of this sequence because the original theatrical cut had this. This is a pickaninny, a racist depiction of a black child with exaggerated features. It was often used in blackface and is quite repugnant. Now, I'm all for preserving media in its original state, and I'll talk about that more with Dumbo and Peter Pan, but given that this particular instance is very short and adds absolutely nothing to the movie, I think Disney did the right thing in excising this. It never needed to have been made in the first place, and the film has a better viewing experience for this not being there. Later on, we do see a different pair of black centaurs that were left in, but they're not nearly as egregious in their depiction, and honestly, the fact that they're zebras is pretty damn cool. Now again, I'm a white guy, so I can't pretend to speak for a demographic that I'm not part of, but this leads into an interesting question. How do you resolve the tension between wanting representation and that representation being a stereotype? Most representation of black people in film in the first half of the 20th century is some level of racist caricature. If you edit all that out, you no longer have that uncomfortable, cringy stereotype, but then you're left with no representation at all. You just have films with only white people. That's why I think, at least in the current moment, that leaving the zebra centaurs in is okay. Yes, they are somewhat sexualized as exotic. Yes, they are acting as servants, but all the centaurs and satyrs are deferent and subservient to Bacchus. He's their leader, and the zebras seem to have a place of higher pride or privilege being his closest attendants. And their inclusion, however brief it is a piece of representation with all the baggage that carries with it. We then move to the Dance of the Hours, easily the funniest part of this whole movie. I doubt most of you viewers have even heard the name Ponchielli before, but you've absolutely heard the theme from this ballet. It's used in that Hello Mata, Hello Fata summer camp letter song. For this rendition, we see various animals in tutus dancing through the day with a lot of comedy derived from their ungainly animal bodies trying to do what human performers do. We then finish with some crocodiles sneaking onto the scene and all hell breaking loose. It's a lot of fun and a nice little breather before we get into the final two segments. Modest Mussorgsky is a somewhat enigmatic composer. He died relatively young, and much of his work was never fully performed during his lifetime and survived only in piano reductions or notes. One of his composer friends, Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, arranged several of these for orchestra after his death, including The Night on Bald Mountain. For Fantasia, Stokowski made further changes, most notably removing a recurring fanfare for the brass that conflicted with his and Disney's concept for it as an animated film. This concept includes the titular Bald Mountain being capped by a giant demon. slowly unfurling his wings and bidding his various fiendish and undead minions to dance for him. He doesn't really do anything particularly evil. He's not out here committing murder or theft or even money laundering. He's just out here living his best life, throwing a rager. The most you could accuse him of is keeping his neighbors awake at night. He exemplifies an aspect of Disney villains that can make them so appealing, their ability to have fun in such a sinister way. He's bad, he knows it, and he doesn't give a shit. There's a reason why people keep asking for him to be added to Villainous. Even though he doesn't really have much of an evil scheme beyond partying, his design is just so memorable and he's clearly having the time of his life. Or death, we don't judge here. Though he goes unnamed in the film, given it has no dialogue, he is canonically called Chernobog, the name given to a possibly spurious deity from Slavic mythology. The name literally means black god in Slavic languages. From how he is depicted here, we can infer that he's not meant to represent evil, really, but more that which is taboo, being naughty under cover of darkness, rebellion, and anarchy. And as the church bell chimes the coming of morning, he shrinks back, once more becoming part of the mountain, leading us directly into the final segment of the film. When I was a kid, I found the Ave Maria the most boring part of the movie, which is a shame since it's at the very end and is the last thing you see and hear. There's not really anything dynamic happening in the animation, and the music is very slow and reverent. It's not exactly gripping entertainment. But now, as an adult, I can appreciate more the craft that went into it. The intricate use of the multiplane camera, these long panning shots zoomed in very close to these candle-carrying figures that had to be animated and minuscule. In fact, the segment had to be reshot 4 times because of how sensitive filming was at so close a zoom. It was finished the day before the film was released and had to be flown to New York and spliced into the reel with only hours to spare before the premiere. But no longer being religious myself, I don't find anything particularly profound or moving in this piece, though it is quite pretty. Just a bit anticlimactic after everything that came before. But perhaps that's what Disney and his animators were going for, more of a denouement, a winding down after 2 hours of excitement. So what exactly was the point of all of this? Do we have a theme, a lesson to take away? I don't think so, and I don't really think there needs to be. I think it's fine for Fantasia to just simply be. The animation is, in my opinion, the very best that has ever been made in this medium, and the music is considered classic for a reason. Like 2001, Fantasia is more an experience than anything else, and it has similarly had a profound impact on filmmaking. It was the first feature film to use stereo sound, now the industry standard. Many films afterward have used classical music as accompaniment, including 2001 itself, which honestly is almost Fantasia-like in its use of music and imagery. There's even a parody that was made, Allegro non troppo, which is honestly worth a watch itself. It has some very funny segments. Whenever a film releases itself from the spoken word and lets its music do the talking, you can thank Fantasia for that. Not every piece of art has to teach you something. Art is whatever we make of it, and it can be different things for different people. For me, Fantasia is 2 hours of beauty in both sound and image. If you haven't seen it yet, do yourself a favor, set aside 2 hours, and let yourself fall into that indigo void. Join me next time as we learn about the benefits of unionization with Dumbo.